We welcome you to the program today. We're studying the book of Job, chapter 41, verses 12 to 34. Job 12, verse 12. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. The Lord continues to impress upon Job the greatness of the Creator himself with the creation. The Lord will speak of the incomparable strength of Leviathan. He will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. The term conceal may literally be translated as keep silent about or concerning. And so the Lord will not conceal, he will not keep silent about these characteristics of his creation, Leviathan. Verse 13. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? The outer coat may refer to the skin, as in verse 7, or to the scales, as in verse 12 of Leviathan. This skin or scales serves as his armor. The word for coat is also translated as clothing in passages like Job 24:7, 24:10, and 31:19. It's also translated as garment in Job 30:18, 38:9, and 14. And so who can strip off his outer coat, his clothing, his garment? Of course, this is a figurative way of expressing that man cannot strip off his outer coat, his hide, and so his skin or scales. No man can approach Leviathan, he says, with a double bridle. You cannot come near him, open his jaws, put in the bits so that you may direct him. Who can approach him, Leviathan, with a double bridle? Not man. Man is not able to do as he might do with other creatures, such as the horse, putting the bit or the double bit in the horse's mouth, and use a bridle in order to guide the horse. He cannot control Leviathan in such a manner. Verse 14. Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? The doors of his face may refer to the mouth or to the jaws of Leviathan. No one can pry open his jaws or mouth, given all of his terrible teeth. One thinks of the sharp teeth that lined his jaws. Think of the dread and the terror at the thought of opening his mouth, filled with all of those terrible or those terror-inspiring teeth. Verse 15. His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. The pride of Leviathan is in his rows of scales. This term is literally translated as shields. All those scales upon his body are like small shields or bucklers. The Lord describes the hard scales that protect Leviathan in verses 15 to 17. He said that his scales are shut up tightly or closely together, as with a seal. Again, not literally a seal, but as with or like a seal. Verse 16. One is so near another that no air can come between them. The rows of scales of Leviathan are so shut up tightly, so tight, that one scale is so close to another, so near another scale, that no air can come between them. They are airtight. Verse 17. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. One might think of chainmail armor that one might wear for protection. The rows of scales are joined one to another. They stick together so that they cannot be parted or separated. And so his scales, skin, these shields protect him. In verses 18 to 21, he then describes his fiery breath. In the description of Leviathan, of course, we see figurative language. The book of Job is a book of poetry. There are many figurative expressions found throughout. There are examples of simile and metaphor in this passage, for example. For instance, consider the use of words like and as. The Lord now describes the fiery breath of Leviathan. In the poem, this might be an example of hyperbole for the steam that comes from Leviathan's mouth. Hyperbole is an example of figurative language. It serves as an exaggeration in order to emphasize some matter. Another possibility is that Leviathan did breathe fire. There are animals today that can do amazing things, such as the unlikely bombardier beetle that can fire a chemical bomb toward its attacker. And so it mixes these chemicals, which are able to produce this hot liquid that's expelled from its body toward its attacker. There are many unusual animals in the world living today. There are animals, no doubt, that we have not found in the sea. And so, of all these sea creatures, which can produce light in different forms, bioluminescence, it might be that Leviathan, this large, perhaps extinct sea creature, produced light, maybe even fire. And so one cannot rule it out. And so perhaps he did actually breathe fire. Or it may be a hyperbole, an exaggeration for the steam that came from his mouth. But let's continue with our study. Verse 18, his sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Note the two parts of the passage. As oftentimes in Job and in many of the Psalms, we see parallels. Sometimes the first or the second helps to explain the other part of the passage. In this instance, we have two parts of the passage. First, the passage describes his sneezings or his snortings flash forth light. And so they throw out flashes of light. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's look at the second part of the passage. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Again, there's that word indicating here this comparison of these two dissimilar things. In this case, a simile using the word like. And so his eyes are not actually the eyelids of the morning. They are like the eyelids of the morning, or the rising of the sun. The term for eyelids is translated as dawning in Job 3:9, such as the dawning of the day. The dawning is literally the eyelids of the day, or the dawn of the day. It may be that his eyes are the first thing that is seen when he rises up, rises out of the water. And so the second part of the passage may explain the first. If so, it may be that his sneezings do not actually flash forth light any more than his eyes are really the dawn of the day, the first light. So keep that in mind as we study these passages. Verse 19. Out of his mouth go burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out. There are burning lights, he says, that go out from his mouth. There are sparks of fire that shoot out of his mouth. Verse 20. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. He describes how smoke comes from the nostrils of Leviathan, like smoke comes from a boiling pot over burning rushes. Verse 21. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. The breath of Leviathan, he says, kindles coals, or lights, or causes the coals to burn. It does so as a flame goes out of his mouth to kindle the coals. And so to set the coals ablaze. And so in these passages, we have a description of his fiery breath. Is he speaking using hyperbole, exaggeration, or did Leviathan actually breathe fire? Verse 20, he describes the smoke, like smoke that might come from a boiling pot over the burning rushes. Verse 21, his breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Verse 22, strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. In verse 22, we see that there is great strength in the neck of Leviathan. The Lord says that sorrow dances before him. Again, not that sorrow literally dances. We see that he is not afraid. It is as though sorrow leaps or dances or goes before him. Perhaps he means that sorrow precedes him. The sight of him with his strength causes others to flee in despair. So you see in this passage, the great strength of Leviathan's strength dwells or resides in his neck. We see how that sorrow goes before him, how he is not afraid, but others are terrified of him. And if he is, as we see, one would have reason to be terrified. Verse 23, the folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. The hide of Leviathan is impenetrable. The folds of his flesh are joined together. While the folds of other animals are soft, the folds of Leviathan are firm, tightly joined together. So while the folds of other animals are vulnerable places, one might think of creases or folds that one which might hang loose. In the case of Leviathan, these folds cannot be moved. From the description, Leviathan is strong, and he is strong all over. He has no weaknesses. Verse 24. His heart is as strong as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. The term literally translated heart can mean understanding, like we see in Job 36:5 and 13. Perhaps the Lord is saying that Leviathan is hard-hearted, not that his heart is literally hard, but that metaphorically his heart is hard-hearted, that he is hard-hearted, that he is without understanding or feeling, compassion. And so the Lord makes a comparison with the hardness of the millstone, which was used to grind meal and grain, like in Isaiah 47:2. In Deuteronomy 24:6, we learn that there were the lower and upper millstones. And so here the Lord makes a comparison in this poetic language of the hardness of Leviathan's heart. Perhaps his heart is actually strong, no doubt, but I think that it's more of the point that he is fierce, that he is hard-hearted in that sense, without compassion. He is a beast, after all, a particularly fierce creature. Verse 25, when he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. There's the image here of Leviathan raising himself up. Earlier, he warned of stirring, arousing Leviathan. How foolish that would be. That no one would dare do such a thing. But here you have the picture of Leviathan raising himself up, perhaps out of the water. At the sight, even the mighty are afraid. They are beside themselves in fear and excitement, besides and because of his crashings. This term, translated crashings, often is translated destructions, like in Proverbs 16:18, 17:19, and 18:12. Pride goes before fall. Earlier, the Lord said in Job 41:10, no one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? And so he made the point earlier in the chapter that if no one is so fierce, so cruel as to dare stir up, agitate, or arouse Leviathan, perhaps from his slumber, his sleep, to disturb him, then who is able to stand against the Lord? Of course, the answer is no one. If you cannot stand against the creation, how could you ever hope to stand against the Creator? Verse 26. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. The Lord describes how these weapons of man cannot avail against Leviathan. Job 41:26-29. Even the sword that does reach Leviathan cannot avail, has no effect, does him no harm. Weapons such as the spear, the dart, or the javelin likewise will have no effect against Leviathan. What other animal could this claim be made for today? Again, the difficulty of trying to find a creature today that fits this description, whether for the behemoth or for the Leviathan, as we see in this chapter. As with the behemoth, only the maker is said to be able to threaten him. Job chapter 40:19, concerning Behemoth, he is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. It uses the same word sword as we see here in verse 26 as in verse 19. And so no one would be able to bring near the sword to Behemoth except God. And likewise, even though the sword reaches Leviathan, it cannot avail. It has no effect any more than the spear, the dart, or the javelin. Verse 27. He regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. Again, the weapons of iron and bronze are nothing to Leviathan. To Leviathan, iron is like straw, and bronze is like rotten wood. He may be speaking, again, using hyperbole, exaggeration in this passage. Then again, perhaps not. Even if he is speaking using hyperbolic language, exaggeration, he's emphasizing the resistance of Leviathan to any of these weapons of man, such as the sword, the spear, the dart, or the javelin. And so they pose him little danger, if any. Verse 26, verse 27. How many animals could that description fit? Verse 28. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. The arrow cannot make Leviathan flee or run for safety. The archer with his bow will not cause Leviathan to run as if he were in any danger. The arrow here is literally son of the bow. And so the archer, or the arrow of the archer with the bow, cannot make Leviathan flee or run away. As he regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood, sling stones become like stubble to him. Again, it's not as though sling stones are literally become stubble, or that iron is actually straw or bronze is actually rotten wood. He's using figurative language here to emphasize the lack of vulnerability of Leviathan. He is a formidable creature. What about sling stones? Perhaps you think of a sling and you think of David. I thought of David as I read the passage. The sling was used to cast stones. The sling could be used as a weapon in war. 2 Chronicles 26:14. David used a sling. Remember how David used a sling and a stone in the sling to strike and kill the Philistine named Goliath from Gath. And so David approached the giant, Goliath, and was able to defeat the giant with the small stone. 1 Samuel 17:40, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. 1 Samuel 17:50. So the stone could be deadly using a sling in the right hands. However, David did not trust in the sling. The Philistine came to David with a sword, with a spear, with a javelin. However, David said that he came to the Philistine in the name of the Lord of hosts. 1 Samuel 17:45. And so we took a side note to look at David, and his faith, his trust in God. But we see here how sling stones, these stones was slung with a sling, could be deadly. Verse 29. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. Leviathan here is said to regard darts as straw. Again, the darts are not actually straw, but he regards them as straw, as if they were. This may be translated, as it was earlier, as stubble. And so we see a variety, straw, stubble. Job 41:28. The darts are like pieces of straw to Leviathan. Leviathan is said to laugh at the threat of javelin. Of course, he doesn't actually laugh, but while he doesn't truly laugh, it is though he does laugh, as the javelins are no threat to him. The whole encounter with man is a joke. It's as though he scorns the very threat of the javelin, as if it was nothing. It was nothing to him. Just stubble, just pieces of straw or grass. Verse 30. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. The Lord further describes the movements of Leviathan in verses 30 to 32. First, he describes the sharp or pointed undersides of Leviathan. They are like potsherds, these broken pottery fragments or pieces. Again, his undersides are not literally sharp potsherds, but are like these fragments of pottery. They're sharp, they're pointed. And so he says he spreads pointed marks in the mire. And so as Leviathan moves, he spreads these pointed marks in the mire or the mud. Remember how Jeremiah the prophet, when he was in the dungeon, sank in the mire, not in the water, but in the mire, in Jeremiah 38:6. And so here you have this creature, Leviathan, leaving behind a trail. Animals often leave footprints or markings in the sand or in the soil, in the dust. And in this particular case, you have this creature leaving behind these pointed marks in the mire. These markings serve to identify the creature. In verse 31, he makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. Leviathan causes the water to churn. He stirs up the water. He agitates the water. And so he uses this figure to describe how Leviathan churns up the water. The deep churns like the contents of a pot that boils. If you've ever boiled water or some other liquid, you know how that it bubbles up, it churns, it rolls in the pot. Well, he also goes on to say that the sea stirs up like a pot of ointment. What exactly is meant by this? Well, again, the first part of the passage helps to understand the second in this case. Just like water might boil in a pot, Here he has a pot of ointment, which bubbles and moves about. And so the sea stirs like a pot of ointment. This might be the image of how it foams up as it's stirred, as the ingredients are mixed together. You've mixed anything in a pot. In this case, the ointment, as it's being mixed in the pot, perhaps something foams up. Perhaps that's what he's meaning here. Basically, the idea is he's traveling in the water, moving about in the water, we see the great churning of the deep, the sea, around him. One thinks of a large animal today and how it churns up the water of the sea. Verse 32, he leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. Leviathan leaves behind him a shining wake. The wake is a track in the water that glistens with the light. This wake is left behind by Leviathan as he moves about in the sea. The wake makes the sea look white or gray. One might think of a boat and how a boat leaves behind a wake in the water. Well, here you have Leviathan traveling through the water, moving about, leaving behind him a wake, and appearing, the water appearing in this shining, glistening from the light of the sun on the water, as if the water had white hair, as if it was white or gray. Verse 33, on earth there is nothing like him, which is made without fear. I think we can all wholeheartedly agree. On earth, there is nothing like Leviathan. He is a creature said to be without fear. As the Maker made Behemoth, Job 40, verse 15, verse 19, the Maker, the Lord God, also made Leviathan, Job 41, 33. The Behemoth in Job 39, or Job 40, excuse me, and Leviathan here in Job 41 were both great. Behemoth being a large animal and Leviathan being a large sea creature. They were unlike any other creatures mentioned by the Lord, and he mentions several in the book of Job. Behemoth was a strong and powerful animal. Job 40, verse 19. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. However, Leviathan was different, even from Behemoth, given his great ferocity. He was fierce. Not only was he fearless, he inspired terror in others, sometimes at the mere sight of this creature. Now, what was his identity? What exactly was Leviathan? We're not told. People have their guesses. There are different ideas. Some think that Behemoth was a hippopotamus, and some think that Leviathan was a crocodile. We pointed out that there are certain things within the descriptions of each of these creatures that do not fit the behemoth as a hippopotamus or the Leviathan as a crocodile. There are some similarities, but there are also differences in these descriptions. Perhaps these creatures are now extinct. We simply are not told. Some have suggested some species of dinosaur. But we see in this, no doubt, a creature that is unlike any other. He says here, on earth there is nothing like him. God created all the other animals that he mentioned and all the others non-mentioned. He concludes with these two great creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And if you cannot, Job, approach these creatures, how could you ever hope to approach me, to stand against me, the Lord God, the Creator? While these, as that great as they are, unapproachable by man, are but creations of the Creator, the Maker. Verse 34. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. Here he concludes the chapter and the description of Leviathan. Leviathan, who is exalted, lifted up, looks down on all who are high, proud. Of all the other creatures, that is, all the children of pride, Leviathan is king. As he said in the previous passage, on earth there is nothing like him. One, you have this great land animal, and second, you have Leviathan, this great sea creature. Just to note, he mentions pride in Job 41:15. His rows of scales are his pride. And so of all the children of pride, of all the other creatures, Leviathan is king. What can we conclude from this great description of Leviathan? In some ways, it leaves us mystified. But we cannot but be affected by the greatness of the description of this creature by the Lord. And if man cannot approach this creature, what about the Creator? The Lord had humbled Job. He had showed Job his greatness, his wisdom, and his power in creation. He concluded with Behemoth in Job 40 and Leviathan in Job 41. We see the purpose of his speech in the reply from Job. Job 42, verse 2, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. This is Job speaking to the Lord. And Lord willing, we'll study that passage in the rest of the chapter next opportunity. Job had no right to question the judgment of God. We can understand giving his suffering, his great affliction. And Job realizes that he spoke rashly. We hope that this lesson has been helpful in better understanding Job chapter 41. We thank you for watching today, and we encourage you to continue to seek the Lord in all that you do. Thank you.